If you're just getting started in video or photography, at some point you're probably going to run into that nagging feeling that you just can't get really great images if you don't spend a whole bunch of money on really high-end gear. And it's a pretty easy trap to fall into because all you gotta do is look at the really amazing images that some of your favorite photographers and filmmakers are coming up with, and then notice that they're doing it with gear that costs about as much as your entire year's rent. And in some cases, actually many times more. But while it's true that the nicer gear is indeed nicer, it's also true that a lot of people tend to overlook how capable a lot of budget gear really is. Which leads me to this little guy. This is the GitUp Git2. It's got a goofy name, it cost me $130 on Amazon, and over the last couple of years, it has become one of my favorite cameras, even sitting on a shelf alongside stuff that costs many times more. I've actually used this as my main camera to shoot everything from travel vlogs to longer form editorial content, and footage I've shot with this thing, believe it or not, has actually ended up on real broadcast television. I've attached it to bicycles, on railings, to the inside of cars, to the outside of cars, on trains, on my head, pretty much everywhere, really. It is a relentlessly versatile little tool. So basically, this video is about two things. Number one, why you shouldn't let your budget gear limit your creativity. And number two, why I love my personal favorite piece of budget gear so much. So, meet the GitUp Git2. First of all, if you're sitting there going, that looks an awful lot like a GoPro Hero 4, you're right. It's a fairly blatant, imitation. Right down to the size, the button layout, the fit and finish, pretty much everything. But crucially, it's not so direct a copy that GitUp would get in trouble for it. At least not under Chinese patent law anyway. If you've never heard of GitUp, they're headquartered in Shenzhen, China, which is pretty much the electronics manufacturing capital of the world, and their entire product line is made up of budget action cameras like this one. I was first turned on to the Git2 a couple of years ago, and after buying mine, I decided I liked it so much that I quickly bought its predecessor, the Git1, which is actually a little better in low light, but inferior in pretty much every other way. And then I also bought a second Git2 right before setting off to Europe for a reading week trip a couple of years ago, which, aside from a couple of roadside shots and some photos, I captured entirely on these little cameras.
Hi!
To give you a quick rundown of the specs, the Git2 has a Sony Exmor IMX206 16 megapixel sensor, which is the same one you'll find in the SJCam M20 and the very popular Yi Lite, and a Novatech 96660 chipset. The lens has a field of view of 170 degrees, the side panel has both micro HDMI and USB Mini B ports, and the SD card slot supports micro SD cards up to 128 gigabytes. And finally, on the back, you get a reasonably bright 1.5-inch LCD display. The battery life is not amazing, but not terrible either. Basically, if you get about an hour and a half of video recording time, you're doing pretty well. I will say that if you're like me and you live in the Great White North where cold winter is a thing, that will severely impact battery life. When I was shooting this video outdoors, I went through a lot of batteries. Fortunately though, good third-party batteries are available for not very much money, and since they're very small, you can fit a lot of them into your camera bag or even in your pocket, so you don't have to worry about running out. In terms of feel, the biggest issue that you usually run into with cheaper gear is that it just feels really cheap. So I mean like crappy buttons and washed out screens and just generally feeling like they got the plastic to make it by melting down a whole bunch of old margarine containers. With the GitUp though, you don't get that. The buttons are actually quite nice, and I can confirm from my own not always so gentle use that they do hold up very well over time. The screen is actually reasonably bright, and it works well in all but the brightest direct sunlight situations. And while good color accuracy is a little much to ask for at this price point, it does fulfill the basic function of, showing you what you're recording, which is kind of all you need. A word of advice though, maybe don't try pointing at things in your shot too often, because it is still a pretty small screen, and that might not necessarily work out too well. And finally, while it is an all-plastic body, it doesn't have that feeling of overwhelming cheapness that you get with a lot of budget gear sometimes. The molding is actually very nice, and the textured feel of all four sides makes it feel nice and grippy when you're holding it, which is good if you habitually dangle it over rivers or something. Obviously, like with any action camera, you can mount it pretty much anywhere. And the Pro Bundle, which is what I got, comes with a pretty respectable set of accessories. And because these are such a blatant GoPro ripoff too, if down the road you choose to upgrade to the real thing, you can still use all the accessories that came with your GitUp. Also important for some people, it comes with a waterproof case, which is good down to 30 meters. So if you're the kind of person that's into filming stuff underwater, the default color profile on the Git2 has nice contrast, and to my eye, colors that are just a little bit oversaturated, but not in the Best Buy TV aisle kind of oversaturated. It's just punchy, and over time I've actually kind of grown to like it. Aside from the normal preset, you also get options for black and white, sepia, colorful, and vivid, which is kind of eyeball burning if you ask me, but it's there in case you want it. So there you go. You also have the standard array of options for different resolutions and frame rates. At 1440p, the Git2 will do 30 frames per second. If you step down to 1080p, it'll do 60 frames per second, and it'll actually do a surprisingly nice looking 120 frames per second slow-mo at 720p. Now there is also an option for 240 frames per second if you go all the way down to 640 by 480, which weirdly enough not that long ago was actually referred to as standard definition. Anyway, sadly I think what it's actually doing is taking the 120 frames per second, duplicating frames, and then encoding it at a, frankly by today's standards, unusable resolution. Speaking of format trickery, there is a 4K 24 frames per second option, but it's not native 4K. What it's actually doing is using something called horizontal interpolation to fill in the gaps in the image to make it take up a 4K frame, but it's not capturing any more actual pixels. So personally, I just stick with 1440p. In low light, the Git2 is not amazing. In scenes where you have some light, it does come up with a pretty decent result, but as soon as you get into a genuinely dark scene like this one, you'll start to notice that the darker areas of the frame are going to look pretty darn alive. But that's mainly just because there are some things about the laws of physics that you just can't change. And being such a small image sensor, it can only do so much when there isn't a ton of light available. That being said though, I have gotten some surprisingly decent shots in spots like this cave in Luxembourg where the light was terrible. So make of that what you will. You'll also notice that the images from the Git2 showcase a staple of action cameras with wide fields of view: barrel distortion. In some cases, I don't mind the kind of fisheye look, but if it really does bother you, it's really easy to correct in post using basic lens correction plugins or presets like the ones I use in Premiere Pro. The photo mode on the Git2 is pretty good. Don't expect DSLR quality, but it does have a self-timer, full manual controls, and even a raw photo mode, if you have the patience to wait for the buffer to actually write the file to the memory card. The Git2 also has a feature called Quick Start Recording. In the menu, it's actually called Quick Capture. And this is something that I will freely admit I've never really bothered with, but probably should have been using this entire time. Basically, the way Quick Capture works is you enable it in the menu, and then if you have the camera off, say like in your pocket or something, and you see something going on that you really want to get a shot of, when you take the camera out, all you have to do is press the record button, and it does some kind of quick boot and just starts recording a video. If you hold down the record button instead of just pressing it, it'll actually start shooting burst photos. Pretty cool. In either case, when you press the record button again, the camera stops recording or taking pictures and turns off again. So you can just put it back in your pocket and carry on. Pretty useful. In video mode, you also get built-in gyro stabilization to smooth out the motion of your shots. This, I think, is one of the Git2's strong points because it works really well. It is important to note, though, that this is digital image stabilization, which means it happens in software, and to do it, the image processor has to crop the frame a bit, so you do lose a bit of your field of view in the process. The Git2 also has a really good time-lapse mode. I've used it a ton. It lets you shoot between 1 frame every 200 milliseconds to 1 frame every 10 minutes. And if you hook it up to a USB power bank like this one, you can shoot a day-to-night time-lapse like this, no problem. One handy little feature is when you're in time-lapse mode, the little camera icon in the top left of the screen will show a little T to tell you that you're in time-lapse mode. And that's basically so that you don't just start recording thinking that you're shooting a video when in reality you're only capturing like 1 frame per second or something. I'd love to be able to say that that has prevented me from ever making that mistake, but yeah, I've definitely recorded some accidental time lapses every now and then. Anyway, in terms of manual settings for both photo and video, the Git2 is surprisingly complete. You can set a custom white balance, dial in exposure compensation, set your own shutter speed and ISO, it gives you 3 levels of digital sharpening, and it even gives you 3 options for what bitrate to record at. Despite that, I almost always have used it with the white balance, shutter speed, and ISO all set to auto. So basically letting the camera make all those decisions for me. Because when I'm shooting with this thing, I'm usually running around like a maniac and don't have time to stop and dial in camera settings. So I have to be able to trust it to get it right. And most of the time, it does. And now for something very unsexy, but also very important. The menu system on the Git2 is really nicely laid out and things are very easy to find. But unfortunately, since it's not a touchscreen, you do have to get used to navigating those menus using the power, record, and settings buttons, which is not always the most intuitive thing ever. But anyway, you do actually get used to it after a while. Mostly. And now we come to the onboard audio, which on a camera like this is never going to be amazing, but it's also not that bad. I mean, you can get away with using it, as long as there's not too much wind. Oh my god. I feel like I'm in a wind tunnel. Most definitely using the handrail right now, just because how friggin' windy it is and how mildly sketchy these stairs are. One thing that is important to note though, and this is something I've noticed on pretty much every single video that I've seen that's been shot on a Git2, so I know it's not just an issue with the ones that I have. You get this sharp, high-pitched ringing that's so pronounced that you can actually see it here on the spectrum analyzer. I suspect that might just be down to the camera not having the greatest audio components inside, or maybe just that that circuitry isn't very well shielded. Fortunately though, it is an easy fix. It really is just that one frequency just above 13.5 kilohertz. So all you have to do is notch that one frequency out and you're good. The whole process only takes a couple seconds, and you can do it with the built-in parametric equalizer plugin that comes with any major editing program. So I tend to file that under mildly annoying, but easily fixable. I've also found that if you're moving the camera around a lot while you're shooting, you will get this kind of clicking noise every now and then. Good morning from Copenhagen, where it turns out I've actually been a massive idiot and forgotten that time zones are a thing. I think that's just down to some of the innards of the camera not being totally secured. It's not a huge deal, but it is something to be aware of. At the end of the day, if you want slightly better audio, what you can do is connect an external microphone to the USB port on the side of the camera right there. Or if you want actually quite good sound, and this is what I've started doing lately, you can get yourself an external audio recorder and a microphone, and then sync up the audio from this with the onboard audio from the Git2 in post. There's also another pretty cool feature that wasn't actually available when the camera was first released, but that is fully functional now: Wi-Fi. To use it, you first download the GitUp app, then on your camera, you hold down the settings button until the blue LED above it turns on, meaning Wi-Fi is enabled. Then you connect the camera to your phone using the most secure password in the history of time, and you're up and running. In the app, you can see a preview of what you're shooting, switch back and forth between video and photo modes, select different resolutions and frame rates, and then of course actually record new clips, which you can then play back. That can seriously come in handy when you're trying to frame up a shot of yourself, or just place the camera somewhere where it's hard to see the built-in screen. Another added benefit is that it's actually a much nicer way of reviewing your clips than going through the fiddly playback menu on the camera itself. Now this last point is pretty nitpicky, I know, but stay with me here, this actually does make a difference. So the micro SD card on the Git2 just goes right in the side of the camera like that. And when you want to get it out, all you have to do is press on the end of the card and out it comes. Now that might not seem like a big deal until you need to transfer large amounts of footage off of your camera and realize that it's actually way faster to just put the card in a USB 3 card reader rather than transferring through the camera, which I suspect is only using USB 2. Now this is an area where the GitUp, in my opinion anyway, actually beats the full-fledged GoPro, because on the GoPro Hero 8 Black, which is what I have here, to get the memory card out, you actually have to open the entire side panel and then either pry the card out from underneath the battery, which I can't do because I don't have long fingernails, or what I actually do, take the entire battery out and then prise your memory card out from under there. It's a huge pain in the ass. So trust me, when you're shooting large amounts of footage and you need to get it off of your camera and onto your computer to start editing in a hurry, it does come in pretty handy to just be able to take the memory card out of the camera with minimal grief. Unfortunately, the Git2 isn't in production anymore. You can still find it on Amazon, but the price has gone up slightly, probably due to limited quantities. For something more current, GitUp now make the Git2P, which is the same camera but uses a Panasonic sensor instead of a Sony, and the new G3 Duo, which comes in a couple different flavors. So there we go, that is the GitUp Git2. And to wrap up this video, I'm actually going to circle back to the 2 points that I had back at the beginning. Number one, the GitUp Git2 is an amazing camera for the money. And in some ways, I almost stop short of saying for the money, because in a couple of areas, it actually stacks up very well against the brand name camera that it's ripping off. Even though mine did recently get replaced by a GoPro Hero 8 Black thanks to a particularly good Boxing Week sale, my trio of these little cameras is definitely still going to come in handy when I need to mount a small camera in a kind of janky place. So they definitely still have a place in my camera bag. Which leads me to my other larger point. If you're just getting started in photography or video, there's no need to feel limited by entry-level gear. There's a ton of really great budget stuff out there that is surprisingly capable. And in some cases, it has functionality that rivals that of the expensive stuff. You also have to keep in mind the law of diminishing returns, because at a certain point, you're spending a lot more money for a camera that really isn't that much better at creating an image than the one you already have. At the end of the day, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it is easy to lose sight of this sometimes, but at the end of the day, it's your skill set that creates the image, and the camera is just the tool that you use to do that. It's not the pots and pans that make the dish, it's the chef. So if you're shopping for your first camera, or if you're feeling a little bit down about your current camera, just remember that as long as it's good enough to get out of the way of your creativity, it's all you really need. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please help me out by dropping a like down there, get subscribed, and let me know down in the comments actually what your favorite budget camera is. I actually kind of want to know. That's all for now. I've been Alexander. Until next time, goodbye.